Today, Mike and I are co-regulating, and we actually just did a little experience together, and maybe we'll share that with you guys later. But before we dive into this very deep and rich topic of co-regulation, I want to just review what we did from the first video. So the three branches of the vagus nerve. And I strongly encourage you guys, if you're watching the second video and you haven't watched the first one, please do go back and watch that first video because it's very deep and rich, and we're going to kind of piggyback off of what we covered in that video here today. So do go back and watch that first video. So hit pause on this one and go back and watch the first one. All right, take it away, Mike. Let's just quickly review those three branches of the vagus nerve.
Yes. So vagus nerve, meaning the wandering nerve, is the 10th cranial nerve. It goes from the brain stem and it goes down into the spinal cord, as well as innervating all the different internal organs to help us engage in life without having to think about digesting, without having to think about beating our heart and breathing. These are things that happen automatically, although you can shift your breathing consciously. Our vagus nerve innervates these different branches for different purposes. So at the lowest level of stress, you might think of this like a green light at a traffic light, right? We're in what's called the ventral vagal parasympathetic nervous system branch. When that's activated, we're experiencing neurological safety and we're able to socially engage. Our cognition is more effective. We have deeper empathy. We can feel into another person's experience. We have more creativity, spontaneity, every part of the human experience that is considered more human than, let's say, animalistic primal parts of ourselves or of animals. This branch engages when we're in safety and we're able to attune to one another's body language. So I smile, you smile back, or maybe I scowl and look off to the side. And if you were with me, you might look over where I'm looking and go, oh, I noticed that you're looking somewhere, unconsciously, and you just do that. It's this automatic matching and mirroring of body language, and it attunes each other's nervous systems. That is, it lowers the stress load so that we stay in that state. Now, when we get into a higher level of perceived threat, there's this concept called neuroception, the perception of our unconscious nervous system, specifically the autonomic nervous system that controls the automatic things. If it notices anything other than that social engagement experience where we're creative and engaging with one another in safety, we go up into the sympathetic, known as the fight-flight branch of the nervous system, where we experience mobilization symptoms. So think about fighting or fleeing. That's movement oriented. It's also movement of sensation and the mind. So anxiety happens in that branch. Playfulness can happen in that branch. Anger, hyperactivity, experiencing dysregulation in your emotions that are chaotic in terms of you're feeling all of these things and you can't quite organize them in your mind. It's a chaotic experience in the negative side, and it's a wonderfully stimulating experience on the positive side. So when we go further up in stress, what ends up happening is we shut down automatically. We don't think about doing this. This happens automatically. So think about a predator and prey animal. And so let's say a cheetah catches a gazelle. I don't even know if they're in the same place, but let's just pretend. And if you look at a nature documentary of this happening and slow down that freeze frame right before the jaws of the cheetah grab the neck of the gazelle, what you'll find is that the gazelle actually collapses right before. Now, why did that happen? It's because that immobilized shutdown response kept the gazelle from struggling and getting its neck broken. So this is a beneficial, adaptive response that we have happen, just like a prey animal would, in order to conserve energy and survive a life threat. Whereas in the mobilization, you might say the yellow part of the traffic light, there's danger, there's life threat when we immobilize. So the symptoms that can show up there in this dorsal vagal parasympathetic branch, hence the term polyvagal theory, the different branches of the vagus nerve. This is the third branch that we didn't get taught about in high school or college or wherever we took our science. It's a evolutionarily speaking, it's the reptilian branch. And the experience is of not feeling and not moving, but it's high stress. So think of it like the gas in the car being pressed and the brake at the same time. Or maybe you might think of it as spinning your wheels. Nothing is moving and we're not feeling. We're not effective in doing anything because our body shuts it down for us. So how does that show up in the human experience? We might be spaced out or depressed or apathetic or feel helpless or hopeless. We might even faint. And so that's a brief overview of the different branches. By the way, you can have a positive, blissful experience of immobilization as well, just like you can have a positive version in mobilization. That would be like Shavasana in corpse pose, where you're just relaxed in yoga, right? Or maybe a blissful sexual experience where you're submitting, surrendering. But
safety or social engagement, though, wouldn't that be the ventral vagal?
So you can have a combination of them. So in order to have play in that middle branch, you need to have the ventral vagal active with the sympathetic branch at the same time. In order to have a positive experience with the dorsal vagal up top, that highest level of stress, you need to engage social engagement, that ventral vagal branch, to bring safety into that experience. So there are positive and negative versions of all these branches working together in combinations. Okay. For example, the fawn response, where we do exactly what, this is unconscious, mind you, what we think someone wants us to do because we've been conditioned to minimize threat before it happens because of early developmental associations that we have with making sure that somebody doesn't get violent or doesn't get verbally abusive. And so we say exactly what we think they want to hear. And this is an unconscious process where we shut down our own needs. So in a sense, that's the immobilized response emotionally. But it's mobilized using the sympathetic branch in terms of taking action and speaking. And the social engagement circuit has to be active, or you couldn't read their body language and detect what it is that you need to do and say in order to minimize any potential threat that might show up. So that's all three branches happening at the same time. Wow. In something as complex as the fawn response. So you could start to imagine all the different states we experience and how some form of immobilization or lack of awareness happens, or mobilization, movement, or hyper awareness, hyper feeling, or this sense of being able to read body language and detect what's going on in another person accurately with that ventral vagal branch. So that's a mouthful, but it's a brief review of what those three branches can do.
That's perfect. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, that leads us.
You're welcome.
That leads us right into co-regulation. So explain to us what co-regulation means.
So co-regulation is the effective managing of our autonomic processes. So, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, all the things that keep us happy and healthy mentally, emotionally, physically, in terms of our nervous system, having our body do what it's meant to do when it's in a safe position. But it happens as a result of the attunement you have with another person. So co-regulation goes two ways in the adult experience. Whereas like a mother-infant bond, for example, is more of a one-way experience. The mother is bonded to their baby, and they have an oxytocin release, and it feels good. And so there's a sense of regulation going on. It does reduce stress levels for the mother. But mostly what's going on is a one-way experience where the infant is learning, this is unconscious, mind you, to regulate their nervous systems based on what body language the mother is showing. So this could be any caregiver. I mentioned to you before we started the recording that my grandmother passed away yesterday, and she was a major attachment figure for me in childhood. She took care of me a good portion of the time when I was very young. And I've been reflecting on this quite a bit. And what patterns she passed on. She had this love of Native American culture, for example, and she would take me to powwows, and she would read me stories of the myths of the different tribes, and help me to connect to their spirituality. And this kinship I have with Native American culture, and it just feels like home to me, likely was at least in part supported by what she showed me with her love of that culture, and what she experienced with that uh, imprinted on me, you might say,
Mhm.
from how she experienced that herself. My mirror neurons, there are these neurons in the center of our prefrontal cortex, called mirror neurons, and they might more accurately be called sponge neurons. Dr. Dan Siegel calls them that as a nickname, because they soak in the experience of body language that regulates your nervous system. Now, here's a really important point, because early development, where we attune to our caregivers automatically, sets the blueprint for how we interact with people throughout our lives. Now, you can change that trajectory, but 10,000 neurons and synapses being pruned and created and adjusted per second in infancy versus a couple hundred a day at best as an adult, it's not very close in comparison. So yes, we have neuroplasticity throughout life, but that early development is so important, and it sets the tone. And here's the point I wanted to make that I think is really important to focus in on. In a sense, self-regulation isn't really a thing. It doesn't really exist in isolation. Self-regulation exists because of what we soaked in with our mirror neurons from our developmental experience with our caregivers. They set the blueprint through co-regulation, and we are repeating co-regulation internally. So the regulation of our nervous systems, our health, happiness, well-being, mentally, emotionally, physically, is set in that early developmental phase through the parent attuning to us emotionally. And that body language exchange allows us to repeat that unconsciously internally in this sense of parenting ourselves. It's from the models we got early on.
Right.
You can adjust, but like I said, 10,000 neurons and synapses per second versus a couple hundred a day, it's most effective early on.
So I can't remember if I shared this in the last video or not, but I'll share it again if I did. I had this experience a few months ago where I actually went back into my fetal self and I reclaimed my nervous system and the sovereignty of my nervous system. And I, released my mother's nervous system and my father's nervous system from my body. And
Yes.
since that time, I have a different experience with self-regulation
Mm-hmm.
and co-regulation. I guess it all is part of the same thing. uh it's been very fascinating to be with my nervous system and not my parents. And
Mm-hmm.
as you say, that imprint is so significant, though. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm still running to some degree from my parents' nervous system. But I share that in what's possible in our ability to regulate ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
and you said that this idea of self-regulation, and correct me if I didn't hear this correctly, that this idea of self-regulation isn't truly self-regulation because we're running from the old patterns of our infancy and early childhood.
Yes.
So, do you have any strategies for uh, again, before we get into co-regulation, do you have any strategies for self-regulating, extracting from our parents or our caregivers in those early years and reclaiming our own ability to regulate?
Absolutely. Yes. So we can, just like you were talking about reclaiming the sovereignty in your nervous system, we can adjust our relationship to our own nervous system. Ultimately, just like our relationships one another help to co-regulate our nervous system, we can, in a sense, have a relationship with ourself. And you might call that a co-regulation experience. You're using your will, your conscious decision to view certain parts of your life experience and focus on that and get those neural connections to change inside you. So yes, it's a big difference between what happens in infancy versus what can happen now. But there are tons of things you can do in everyday one-on-one interactions with the people in your life, and particularly in intimate relationships, because that will fire up, that is, activate the neurons of your attachment system from early on. And so your partners will bring up patterns, that phrase that I hear people often say, oh yeah, I married my mother, I married my father, as far as the traits, and I didn't see it coming. So there's an interesting experience where early on, this infatuation stage, they call it, or the honeymoon phase, where we get, this flood of oxytocin and dopamine to want, and we have a reduced amount of serotonin, so we don't think so clearly and we obsess a bit. And this experience of being looking through rose-colored glasses at our partner allows us to bond more deeply and form this new attachment bond, just like we had with our caregivers initially. But again, it's a two-way street versus in infancy, it was more one way, right? So what I'm getting at is we can direct our nervous systems to be more regulated through practice with people we interact with. It's our relationships with other people that we can then mirror inside. So I would argue that it's unlikely on an island by ourselves that we would do very well at learning to change our regulation patterns. Maybe a little. And sure, we wouldn't have the negative body language that brings up old associated cues from trauma, let's say, from our caregivers or early life experiences. Those triggers wouldn't be there, but we sure wouldn't be able to improve our ability to regulate in a full sense, because it's those mirror neurons throughout life that allow us to attune with people. And so we're fine tuning our relationship with ourselves, and through feeling into ourselves deeply, we recognize that body language in other people on an unconscious level, I'm saying. So that's all to say that, yes, you absolutely can improve your blueprint, your ability to regulate yourself. And I would focus on relationships because they are the
That's
most
where you're going to
powerful
get the
tool to do
most
so.
information, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. Sue Johnson, adult attachment researcher. There are two schools of thought and focus around attachment theory. Uh, Two basic schools. One is around regulation and early development, and there are implications about how it goes into the adult experience. And then there's romantic attachment, that is adult attachment studies. And they have a slightly different category for disorganized / fearful avoidant, the one that has the PTSD cycle where you have both types going on.
I would like to get into this a little bit because I think it's part of co-regulation. But before we dive into that deep end,
Mm.
I wanted to ask about environment versus person because, we've been talking about co-regulation in the context of interacting with other people. But I find certain environments support my ability to self-regulate and certain environments don't. So I do feel like there's some sort of co-regulation that happens at an environmental level also. Is there research on that? Can you speak to that?
So I wish I knew more research about, for example, regulating as we connect to nature. I think that there is some research out there on it because I've heard it mentioned. Uh, I can only speak from my personal experience
Okay.
connecting to nature when I go out and feel the sun on my face and feel the wind blow, and I'm out there connecting with all of the plant life and animals. It's definitely a regulating experience. Well, okay, I'll give you an example that we do know around connecting to our environment that's not human. So mammals, specifically dogs and cats, and other domesticated animals like horses and cows, even they have similar vibrational frequencies that they regulate to. So when you see a dog and cat and you go,
As to each
oh,
other or as to humans? They have similar
to humans,
vibrational frequencies
to
as humans.
humans,
Okay.
yeah, that we do.
Gotcha.
So when you see a baby and you go, oh, aren't you so cute? And you do the same vocal tones to a dog, they respond to that in a very similar way. You
Mhm.
get this mutual flood of oxytocin. Oh, it's so cute. And they realize that you're paying attention to them and giving them love. And this experience, by the way, Bowlby originally wanted, who created attachment theory, wanted to call it love theory. But his wife said, oh, the scientific community will never buy it. You have to call it something else. So originally, he was studying the patterns of love, the exchange of the energetic relational patterns between people. But the point is, yes, in your environment, that's non-human. We know that in dogs and cats, that's why you have service animals that
Mhm.
help people who have deep trauma. They have trouble regulating their nervous systems, and so they have that animal with
Right,
them at all times to help
right.
keep them more regulated.
Right. Okay, so let's take it a step further because I have experiences in nature with non-domesticated animals, animals that maybe you're supposed to be afraid of, like rattlesnakes or bobcats or something like that. I have experiences in nature where when I am able to be in that calm space, I think you call it vagal, or not dorsal, the other one, ventral vagal.
Ventral vagal, yeah.
Yeah, I'm working on it. When I'm able to be in that calm space, the animals just, they either hang out with me or they just look at me. There's no like running from each other or, if I'm not scared, they're not scared. And I have to wonder, are we co-regulating in in those times?
Yeah, I have no doubt there's something going on there in attuning to each other's nervous systems. It sounds like you have a Snow White experience, and and I think it's no mistake that that's an archetypal dynamic, that character of Snow White, that we all go, I believe that that's possible. We the when we go into a storyline and we suspend disbelief, I think there's a universal truth there, that ability to connect to all life that we're attuning to and going, oh yeah, that resonates. Oh, that feels so good. I wonder what it would be like if I could be in her shoes and be that connected to the animals. It's something we can go, that's inspiring. Why does it inspire us? Why does it touch something inside? I think it's because we know there's something there that we can all connect with.
Yeah. I actually have a good story about that. It was probably like 15 years ago. I was running in the mountains in Utah and there was a mama, I think it was a moose. It was so long ago. It was either a moose or an elk. A mama moose and her baby in on the trail. And so when I saw her, I kept running. I might have slowed down, but I was just like, I sent her a telepathic message. I was like, "Hey, I just want to get past here. Like, maybe you want to move off the trail so that, it's all safe for everyone or whatever." And she looked at me and moved off the trail with her baby, and I ran past and it was fine. And I was telling my brother about it later, and he was like in shock and horror, like, "Oh my gosh, you could have gotten hurt," and blah blah blah. And I was like, "No, it was fine." So
It's so great.
it's funny how we make up these stories about how we're supposed to interact with wild animals. And if we could take more of a scientific approach, perhaps, and understand co-regulation and how that works, maybe we could have a whole new paradigm about how we can interact with animals in nature. Just saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, if I may, I have another chart that I could share that would
Sure.
explain a deeper level. Okay, just one moment. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. So there's a deeper level of perception that's going on in any given moment. Just let me know if you can. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong chart. One moment.
We might want to look at that one too, though, later.
Yes, yeah, they're all pretty valuable. That was about how um, different levels of stress correlate with the different attachment styles.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So this one is about the different layers of memory and the perception that go with that. So in this context, memory is best understood as the way neurons fire that allow us to perceive and sense something that we've perceived and sensed before. So if you see, I use this metaphor a lot, but I'm going to use it again. If you see a cat and you can see that it's a cat, and you can go, that's a cat. That's called explicit declarative memory. That is, it's a label that you can use, and you can communicate with somebody else. And if they're not in the same room or the same area, and you say, hey, there's a cat here, someone will know what you're talking about, right? This is the most surface level of perception. And because you've seen a cat before and you know the word cat, you can say that, and it's something that you've seen and you understand the associations there. So your neurons are firing in a way that allows you to use language. Okay. But then beneath that, we have explicit, also in the conscious realm, episodic memory. And that means the emotions that you experience. So let's say you had an experience of a cat that you just loved, and you pet and cuddled. He or she was purring all the time, and you just had this experience of co-regulating. It was just a wonderful experience. And you see the cat, and immediately you have that emotional response. And you go, oh, look, it's a cat. I happen to have allergies to cats, and I was scratched by cats a lot. So my emotional response is very different when I see a cat. Immediately, I'm like, okay, I need to be careful. Is this cat going to scratch me? Maybe I shouldn't get too close, even though I do actually love cats. Am I going to get an allergic reaction? Am I going to get inflamed in my eyes and have them water and not be able to smell as well as I'd like to? So this is all in the conscious realm. Okay, the explicit memory and perception. And don't worry, I'm getting to the point here. So below the surface of conscious awareness is what's called implicit memory. And there are two basic types. The next level down of sophistication is what's called implicit emotional memory. And what that refers to is body language. So when I see that cat, I can say the word cat, say, hey, there's a cat here, and I can have my emotional response that's there. But my body language is going to show you, if you're watching me, what's going on in my nervous system. So my reaction might be, there's a cat there, right? Somebody else might go, oh, and you can see their facial expressions, their tone of voice, their gestures, their postures, their body language shows implicit emotional memory that's associated with cat, right? At a deeper level, and this is what we need to understand when we're talking about co-regulation, nervous system regulation in general, health, happiness of the human experience, we need to understand what's called implicit procedural memory, otherwise known as body memory. So it's something that happens automatically below the surface of awareness. So I mentioned before, perception of your autonomic nervous system is something called neuroception. Scans the environment and detects cues of safety or danger or life threat, and adjusts to the appropriate branch so that we can have the resources we need to survive or thrive in that situation. So what we need to get here is that the foundational layer of neurons firing associated with whatever we're experiencing in our environment starts down at a level that's below our conscious perception in the body implicitly. So that automatic response below the body language of implicit emotional memory is this experience of my nervous system immediately going, for myself personally, danger. You might have a negative experience here before I can even consciously get that I even saw a cat. My unconscious picked that up right away. The difference
wild.
the difference between conscious, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share here and continue. So underneath what I can possibly perceive is this body reaction of going into one of those branches of the nervous system and basically operating based on that. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent because I think it's helpful here. When someone experiences early trauma, their sense of safety is skewed because they didn't get a sense of establishing that through safe experiences and emotional attunement. And so what they end up experiencing in relationships is this constant false flag of danger or life threat, even, depending on what our relational experience is. So for years, men who were well built muscularly and had a confident attitude, I interpreted as negative, arrogant, dangerous. They must be untrustworthy. Why? Because my dad was that way.
Hmm.
And he hurt me physically and was not kind emotionally, not all the time. But this is something that my nervous system recognized
Yep.
as the default. And so it took a long time to integrate that in myself and actually work through my own self-hatred as a man and looking so much like my father. All of a sudden I started to realize, oh my God, I have those characteristics. What do I do about that? And so that goes into shadow work and recognizing where the things that we don't like in other people reflect something inside. That's a whole other subject. But the experience of what we're perceiving in our environment has to do with that base level that we learn early in development, and it adjusts and moves through a trajectory based on our other life experiences. So I had all these wonderful people show up in my life and help me shift that implicit response, where my self-esteem started to improve because I started to have reflected back to me with their body language. For example, an amazing wrestling coach and a housemaster that took me into the dorm because even though I lived in town and it was usually for people outside of town, they knew I had a bad home life and they took me in. It changed everything for me at that point.
Right.
And it took a lot longer because neurons don't turn over at the same rate in teenage years, but still significant compared to adulthood.
Right.
So it was instrumental in shifting my experience from one of constantly being in this automatic sense of, okay, where's the danger, where's the possible life threat, where, and this unconsciously setting the tone for my body language, my emotional experience. I was hyperactive and spaced out, dissociated all the time because of that, those cues in the environment
It
constantly.
makes so much sense, Mike. I don't have a history of feeling unsafe with partners, but I had an experience with a partner once where I never knew what to expect from him. And eventually it really dysregulated my nervous system. And I had the awareness that, wow, my nervous system is starting to see him as a threat in some way, even though he was totally non-threatening, totally beautiful man, like nothing, no abuse, nothing like that. But because my nervous system, we couldn't co-regulate, my nervous system started to see him as some sort of enemy or something. So it's very interesting how this works. And I've had a safe childhood. Like there was nothing like that in my childhood. Some subtleties that I could point to probably with my mom's anxiety or whatever, but nothing, I had a foundation of safety. So my experience is a little different than yours in that this is something that happened in my adulthood. And I got to notice how my nervous system responded to that. And because I'm very self-aware, I did some things with my nervous system to, give it assurance. But in the end, it wasn't, it just didn't work, you know?
Yes. And there's an interesting evening out of things that happens depending on our life choices and our environment, the people in our lives, that sometimes can even things out in a sense, as far as that early developmental foundation and how that can, extend through life and create sort of a handicap as far as the ability to perceive safety and good relationships. And people who had more of a safe experience, that if they didn't work through uh, reintegrating into safety, they didn't necessarily learn a level of resilience that somebody who has been through what I've been through, for example, and come out of it to a certain level. It's like I've had war training. I've had, in a sense, emotional military training. And so when I'm in a difficult situation, it's a little bit easier for me to bounce back because I've learned to.
I get it.
But it
Yeah.
was so hard to learn to do that. It took a long time.
Yeah.
But now that I'm in that experience, it's difficult. So there are actually studies that Stan Tatkin points to. He's a wonderful attachment researcher. Highly recommend his TED Talk. He talks about procedural memory. Um, Stan Tatkin, for anyone who wants to get that name. So there are actually studies on how adult trauma in relationships can be more impactful to that adult than someone who is struggling with early developmental issues. And that was a huge surprise when they did that research. They weren't
Interesting.
expecting that, because when you have early developmental trauma or high stress load for whatever reason, it predisposes you to go back into that mode when bad things happen. So the people who had, developmental trauma, when if they were in New York on 9/11, they studied some of those people and they found that the people who had it the worst, the PTSD response, had developmental trauma early on. And so it made them more predisposed to reverting, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So there are all sorts of nuances. You were asking what we can do, and I'm reminded of this concept of what's called limbic system therapy. It's also referred to as limbic body therapy. And there's so many things that can fit into this category that helps to give your body more resilience so it regulates more effectively. Singing,
Yeah.
acting, tai chi, yoga, working out if you're doing it in a way that doesn't cause more stress. I could get into the nuances of that. Martial arts, where you're learning all of these things involve learning a skill where you build competence and a sense of, I can handle adversity.
Yeah.
Oh, if something comes up, I have training for this. Oh, I feel comfortable now where I used to feel scared. It changes the context of high stress states so that our nervous system starts to associate high stress states with, I'm going to be the one that can help other people who are vulnerable now. It changes that. So I would say that mentorship, as you learn skills and you can help other people, is a relational experience of going, wow, I'm more competent than the people around me and I can help them.
Yeah.
So the idea of me being a victim in this situation is not even something in my consciousness. I'm right there ready to help someone else. And so it's this experience of building skills and competence. And part of that includes, oh, well, I'm able to handle, let's say in the exercise version of those limbic system therapies, I have a higher cardiac output. I have, a higher, what's called VO2 max, your oxygen uptake. And so I have more endurance in situations where other people might be so tired if they're running away from a threat. But no, I can go a couple miles. I'm good. I'm all right. And I can help other people in the process. So this process of self-development does help regulation. And we want to make sure to apply it to relationships so that it imprints, because that mirror neuron experience of body language exchange, that's what makes the difference. It's like a corrective experience where you were talking about regaining sovereignty over your nervous system and letting go the patterns from your mother and your father. As you engage with other people that maybe have similar attachment patterns that you experienced with your parents, and you do it in a corrective way, a way that's better and how you wanted it to be when you were a child, you can call into your space through appropriate boundaries and interacting with them in a more empowered way, a new experience that's more regulated.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's like you're rewriting your childhood developmental patterns.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so let's jump into attachment theory, attachment styles, and we don't have a ton of time, so we won't be able to go too deep, but let's just give people an understanding of what that is and the different types, and then how that relates to co-regulation. I'm sure that will be a natural byproduct of this understanding.
Yes, absolutely. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pull up that chart that I had up before.
Great.
So it gives you an idea of what's happening in terms of stress levels. So the four basic attachment styles, depending on which school of thought you're focusing on, they all include what's called secure attachment, and that's where we're more regulated. Anxious, otherwise known as ambivalent attachment, which is a higher level of stress, more mobilized, feeling chaotic. I need, oh, it's not going to go well, negativity bias, that type of thing, clinging. And then you have avoidant or dismissive. And that's where you're not as attuned to your needs or other people's needs. So you get overwhelmed before you realize that you've taken on too much, often in relationships, and then you end up distancing yourself, trying to stay away from your partner. And often one person's more anxious and one person's more avoidant. And so you have this anxious avoidant dance where the anxious person is reaching, the avoidant person is trying to get distance, and they're both dysregulated, but in different ways. So the fourth style is known as either in adult attachment, uh, romantic attachment, with adult intimate relationships known as fearful avoidant, and in developmental attachment known as disorganized. So I think disorganized is a more helpful label because it describes what's going on more accurately, in my opinion. So let's go all the way back down to lowest level of stress and secure attachment. So when we get our attachment needs early on, which is having a caregiver that's emotionally attuned to us, that is able to be there consistently and to be there constantly. So having a parental caregiver consistently with an infant is really important for healthy development. And this probably bumps up against some ideological challenges with female empowerment. And I'm not saying that women shouldn't go out and work as soon as they can if they need to. Sometimes that's a survival thing. But if there's a possibility of staying with your child, they will develop more secure attachment, and they'll have a more healthy nervous system, and they'll be able to relate more effectively with other people. So you only need to meet your attachment needs as an infant with your caregiver 30% of the time. The other 70% is repair. When you mess up and you come back in and you attune again, and that teaches flexibility in the nervous system. So when you have less than 30% doing it well, as far as attuning to your infant as a parent, let's say, or it's just inconsistent, even if you do it a lot, but you don't repair all the time. Maybe you repair really well for a couple of weeks, and then you have a week where you're depressed or anxious as a parent, or maybe you have mental illness where you have bipolar, and so sometimes you're amazingly attuned, and sometimes you're just not present. It's what's called proximal neglect, where you're there as a parent, but you're not emotionally attuning. It's like the child's talking and you're just gone, or you're or dismissive, like I can't focus on you right now. So that's more what happens with avoidant attachment, where, for example, in the Ferber method, where they encouraged parents to let the infant cry it out, what's actually going on is their stress levels go so high that they go into shutdown. And when this is consistent over and over again, they end up with the avoidant dismissive attachment style. They're disconnected from their needs. They're numbed out. Dissociated is a good word to use there. And so there are a lot of high functioning avoidance in our culture. I would venture to say that we have an avoidant culture in general, focusing on external things, looks, money, power, achievements, status, that type of thing. Because it's that idea of filling the hole, the void that we don't realize is there, with things rather than connecting with people. And that's an avoidant attachment adaptation to not having that attunement early on so much. It would be considered on a neurological level neglect, even if the parent didn't know they were doing that. They probably had neglectful parents emotionally, and their parents, and then their parents, and it passes through the generations that way. So all the different attachment styles have these patterns that are actually 75 to 85% predictable, not only to the generation that's about to come, but the next one as well. And that is striking statistically. 75 to 85% predictability is just astounding. 50% would be, publish worthy, and 60%, wow. 75 to 85, that's incredible. It's because of this experience. So briefly, disorganized is where both the anxious and the avoidant patterns happen. See that line above and below is called the PTSD cycle. And, symptoms, for example, like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, where you're spaced out, that's more immobilized. And then you're hyperactive, that's a little lower in stress. You're able to feel more and you're trying to get out of it, but you get stuck up and down. Addictive cycles happen there as well. And what's happening is, if you look at the hand model of the brain, this is the brain stem. This would be considered the limbic brain. So reptilian, mammalian, primate, like a human. We're in that category. So our cortex is regulating the unconscious parts of our nervous system when it's online. That would be secure functioning. If someone has anxious patterns, they're going to flip their lid and they're going to have more uh, anxious patterns going on in terms of their attachment system is going to activate and they're going to have protest behavior. They're going to act out and try to get their partner to come back to them, just like the child did with the parent, and maybe they were inconsolable, and they just cried and cried and cried. Now the avoidant is also disconnected from their cortex, regulating their unconscious parts, but they're higher in stress and they're more dissociated. They're disconnected. So disorganized, and this is what I was getting to, the fourth style. Not only is the cortex not online, but the impulse to attach, which is mammalian, and the impulse to run away, which is a survival response at a reptilian level, they are in conflict. I want to connect with my caregiver because they are my source of development and ability to attune and regulate my nervous system, but they are a threat. Or maybe they were just traumatized as a kid, and so they're constantly showing body language of fear. That's going to create this idea of, oh no, I should be scared, or they're actually a threat, I need to run away. And so there's this inner conflict. I want to reach out, I need to run away. And so in early infant studies on this, called the infant strange situation, children who had disorganized attachment would do pretty disturbing behavior. They'd pull out their hair, they'd bang their head on the wall, or they'd run in circles instead of going to their caregiver when they needed soothing. And so this gives you some idea of how much more challenging someone with abuse in their early developmental history is compared to, let's say, anxious or avoidant. Yes, they're not completely regulated, but they're consistent. That is, the avoidant person will stay disconnected from their emotions, but they'll probably stay intellectually focused and structured, and maybe they have great habits. And so they avoid getting overwhelmed, which they tend to do in relationships, by keeping a distance. Okay, that's adaptive based on what they developed with. And the anxious person is going to do the same thing that they did as a kid. They're going to reach out and they're going to, maybe start trouble with their partner, not realizing that starting fights is an anxious ambivalent response, trying to get them to respond. Mm-hmm. Even negative attention is attention.
Right.
And so that experience of consistently being, ambivalent and all over the place, that's predictable. As soon as their attachment system gets triggered, they're going to do what they need to do to get the attention of their partner, and so on. So those are the basics.
Wow. It's so fascinating. So, oh gosh, there's so much we could dive into. But let's just talk about basic co-regulation, because it would be fascinating to talk about co-regulation regarding each of these styles, but we'd be here another hour. So let's talk about basic co-regulation, and let's focus it specifically on romantic partnerships and what people can look out for to develop more awareness about how they are co-regulating with their partner.
So you want to personalize it to what each person needs. And this is really important because safety is different depending on the developmental patterns of each person. So let's take the example of somebody who's more anxious and somebody who's more avoidant. They're not going to have, both of them, the flexibility or the presence of mind when a fight happens. The avoidant person is going to push away and the anxious person is going to reach. And they both need to go, okay, we've done this before. How can I look into the implicit level of what's going on and not only hold compassion for myself, but for my partner? Let's, stop the bleeding first, and then we'll work on patching up the wound, right? So the experience of the avoidant is they need space because they're overwhelmed very easily. They didn't develop their social and emotional circuitry in the right hemisphere of their brain to the same degree that the anxious person did. And as a matter of fact, the anxious person hyper developed it to the point where they're super sensitive and have negativity bias, and they tend to smother their partner. I'm being overly general here. So what you want to do is figure out, okay, so how much attunement in your repair is helpful in a middle ground that works for both people. So
when you say attunement, what do you mean by that?
So when somebody does something to their partner and the partner reacts in a negative way, and maybe that first partner says, oh, I didn't mean to, and gets defensive, and they end up in this back and forth experience where they're both blaming the other person. Um, they need to soothe themselves and each other. And so this is the repair that happens in secure attachment functioning. It doesn't need to be perfect. They just need to make sure to repair. So by coming back together and figuring out, okay, so what is a habit that we can use whenever we're dysregulated and we're not getting along? My suggestion is not to go to language and talk it out, because that explicit layer is just the tip of the iceberg and it's not addressing the root. The root is in the body.
Yeah,
So,
I always need like put your hand on me or hold my hand
mhm,
to, when we're in the repair process.
absolutely. And that's a really healthy thing too. That's a co-regulation experience. You're feeling their touch and getting a sense of their presence, and it helps you to down regulate, to lower your stress load.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are studies that show people who are experiencing pain, when a loving partner is holding their hand, the brain registers less pain as a result of that support, that love from their partner.
Yeah.
It's so cool. It's this part of the brain called the anterior cingulate gyrus. It lights up with emotional and physical pain. It works in the same circuits, the emotional and physical pain. So when somebody's physically experiencing pain, you can actually help soothe them emotionally, and their perception of pain will reduce.
That's
So
beautiful.
I want to get to a technique that's helpful generally for both types. And I say both, meaning you tend to be on one side or the other of the spectrum at any given moment. You're more dismissive or you're more anxious, right? And so eye contact is very stimulating. And talking about what's going on generally revs up the stress response. Whenever we think versus feel and be present, that elevates the stress response, uses different brain circuits, and the avoidant person will get overwhelmed very quickly. So finding something that the avoidant person can handle and will help them co-regulate in ways that they don't know they need, because they're not aware of what they need. Generally, the avoidant people are just going to dismiss and push away, and they're not doing any better. All they're going to do is distract themselves. So that closeness, the eye contact, that loving gaze is going to overwhelm them. That's not going to create safety for them. They're not used to it.
Interesting. Okay.
It's too much. It's like, it's like looking directly at the sun. It's like too much. I can't handle that. Too
Yeah,
much love,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And they don't perceive it that way as too much love, but it's overstimulating because their circuitry isn't developed in a way that's ready to handle that. So they need to learn to take it in doses. It's like if you're uh, dehydrated in the desert, you don't finally, when you get water, chug it all. You'll throw up. You have to take little sips and gradually get your body to adjust to that nourishment, right? So my suggestion is to avoid eye contact, but create closeness with a hug where, like, can we agree when we're in a rupture and something's not going well between us? Can we just take a moment to hug and breathe together, chest to chest, belly to belly? This is an exercise that Stan Tatkin, the attachment researcher I mentioned, recommends. And I think it's a great one because it avoids eye contact because your heads are facing the opposite direction,
Mhm.
right?
So this
And
works both for anxious and avoidant, you're saying. Okay.
yes, the anxious person gets the touch and the attention and presence that they need.
Yeah.
And the avoidant person doesn't have to have eye contact. They don't have to do anything but just be there. It doesn't require emotional attunement that they maybe haven't developed. You can
Okay.
get the bodies to co-regulate first, and then we'll work on the emotional stuff later
Okay.
when they're resourced. So what happens is, if you embrace like this in this exercise, what you do is you agree to stay in that embrace until the other person relaxes. You both have this agreement. And so if one person is relaxed, but the other isn't, okay, well, you're not finished yet. And you
Uh,
wait until you're attuned.
I
What
like
will
it.
happen is your nervous system start to sync up together,
Yeah.
and your breathing will start to synchronize naturally. You won't have to do it on purpose. It will happen by itself. And it may take 30 seconds and it may take 10 minutes.
Okay.
And you might need to take a break if you're an avoidant. You're like, okay, that I can't hug for that long. Let's try it again in 5 minutes. Let me have a little space and then come back and try it again. It's like
All right. So
dosing it appropriately. Yeah, I know,
what
go ahead.
happens if, this day and age, a lot of people have long distance relationships, they're like meeting on Zoom to connect. What happens if if partners are in a fight and they need to repair, they obviously can't do that exercise. Then what? Then what do we do?
So if physical proximity is not an option, my suggestion is to self-regulate together. So if eye contact is too much for the avoidant partner, okay, can we do it with eyes closed, or can I avert my eyes? Knowing that it's not that I don't want to connect with you, but I'm overwhelmed by that. And
Okay.
so you're present, you can hear each other, and you can interact with, there are so many tools for this. There's a Imago method, there's nonviolent communication. I personally love nonviolent communication used in a way that's not robotic. So there are phases of it, steps in nonviolent communication for it. So I'll give you an example. So let's say the avoidant partner comes home late for dinner, and the anxious person has dinner prepared and it's cold by the time they get home. They have a rupture. They're not doing very well. And maybe, the avoidant person goes to a friend's house and now they're on Zoom. Okay. And so what they both want to do is connect to the 4 steps of nonviolent communication, which are observation, free from evaluation, feelings, free from judgment, needs, free from strategy, and requests, free from demand. So each of those phases is not just, they're not just intellectual. Observation, free from evaluation is like, okay, what happened? If I was looking through a camera at this and I didn't know the people involved, I would see, okay, 5 o'clock dinner was ready. The person walked in at 7:05. It's like, okay, that's what happened. That's observation. The evaluation might be, you don't care about me. Why wouldn't you come home on time for dinner? Because I prepared that for you. I wanted to have this connecting experience. I made your favorite meal. And they can go on and on about evaluating why it happened, what it means about their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just observe and be in our bodies. Okay, this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps even if you don't feel the need to apologize, just apologize, because it might help the other person's nervous system, and just be in your bodies, breathe together for a moment. That's the first step. Second is sharing what your feelings are and mirroring that back to each other, free from judgment. And that allows you to empathize with each other. Maybe it's mechanical, but it still allows you to know that your partner heard what you're feeling. And that does something to the nervous system in terms of calming it. Okay, all right, at least we're connected there.
Yeah.
Get to the third stage of needs, free from strategy. And this is where the magic happens. So needs are universal. Like, we all need safety. We all need belonging. We all need connection. We all need a sense of significance in our community, and so on. There's this, you can go through the chakras and look at the different qualities of the human experience, and you can find, where your needs might fall, but you share that with one another. And at the point which one partner can share what their needs are, and the other partner can share it back to this person's satisfaction, and vice versa, you're going to be connected at the heart level. And this does wonders for regulating the nervous system, because you are in mutual understanding, mutual respect. You've put aside any judgment, or this is how we need to fix this. That's strategy. Let's put that aside for a second. Let's connect at the heart first.
Oh, beautiful.
And then you have requests, free from demand. And you can start to go, okay, so now that we've connected and we feel bonded and we're calm, now we can make requests of one another. Like, okay, I really need more time before I come home for dinner. Okay, well, I need you to come home when you say you will, right? And so those are requests, and you can get creative with that, however it works
That's
for you.
awesome.
But yeah, so that's an example of
Really,
non-proximal
yeah,
repair.
yeah, really great tools. Gosh, Mike, you're such a wealth of information. We could, there's there's so much that we talked about today. Is there anything that you want to conclude with on the topic of co-regulation? Is there anything that we didn't cover that we really need to cover before we end our discussion today?
I would say that relationship is what makes the world function.
Yeah.
You might say love is what makes the world function. If we come from that perspective, it changes priorities. The co-regulation really is the exchange of the energy of love through body language if you're going to talk about it scientifically, and the nervous system response. But that also includes a relationship with ourselves and the experience of creating a blueprint that is the most secure that we can possibly experience. So it's about simultaneously working on regulating our own nervous system through awareness and doing the work, and sharing that with other people. Your life will be so much better. You can't even imagine it if this is what you prioritize over, let's say, achievements and, career and whatnot. There was a study done at Harvard, a longitudinal study of adult development. And I think this is a good place to conclude. And they followed, older teenagers, younger 20s, boys from Boston. And half of them were from Harvard, and half of them were from a really underprivileged area. And they followed them throughout their lives. It's been over 80 years now, and the study's still going. And there was one US president, and they won't say who that is. And of all of the different facets that they studied, they did brain scans, blood pressure, subjective questionnaires, what's going on in your life, what are your relationships like, and so on. The number one factor that determined the highest level of happiness, health, and well-being was quality relationships. This is what creates the best life possible.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. That's my experience. I love that. So thank you so much, Mike. What I'd love to do is just co-regulate with our community now and just go through a really brief experience of what we can do to co-regulate with each other, similar to what you took me through before we hit the record button.
Okay, cool. So what I'd like everyone to do who is watching here, if you would like, is to either with eyes open or closed, notice what's more comfortable. Notice the feelings of your feet on the floor. Maybe you're in bare feet, socks, or shoes. Where do you feel the weight? Is there more weight on the left foot or the right? You might notice that your breath is doing something as it flows in and out, just noticing it, not trying to fix or change your breath, just observing it. And you might even take in awareness of your sensations, let's say of your feet and where the pressure is. On the inhale, noticing. And on the exhale, letting that go. So the next inhale is a new moment. And even though they might be the same sensations, observe them as if you never have before, with beginner's mind. Exhaling and letting those go. As you notice the different parts of your feet and where the weight might be, you might start to notice other sensations like temperature or feelings of expansive or contractive feelings in the muscles. You might notice a sense of weight, heaviness, or lightness. You can notice your feet still, or you could move on to maybe your facial muscles, your eyes, your neck, shoulders down, your arms to your fingertips. Where do you feel most warmth? Noticing your breath in and out. Where do you feel the most cool? What part of your body? And whatever sensation you're focusing on, whether it's temperature, weight, expansive feelings or contractive feelings, or whatever other sensations you notice, focus in on that one part of the body where you feel that one sensation. Your breath flowing naturally as you focus in. Can you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being the most of that sensation, if it's warmth, then 10 being the most warm, 1 being the least, and so on. What I'd like you to do now, as you've fine-tuned your awareness of different sensations, is just take a couple deep breaths, a little deeper than before. And go ahead and let your vocal cords vibrate with sound. Nice long exhale. Let's do two more of those. Deep inhale and long exhale. You can even sigh. One more breath in, deep as is comfortable, and let that go. Bringing your attention back into the room if your eyes were closed, and just noticing how you feel now, perhaps, versus how you felt before you started.
That's awesome, Mike. Thank you. I would like to give, before we say goodbye, I'd like to give one little tip for people. If you are in an argument with your partner or in a fight, before you even get to that point, just pick a place on your body now and feel that part of your body. Maybe put a hand on that part of your body. And then once you and breathe with that and work with yourself to cultivate peace and to self-regulate in this moment, and you're not in stress right now, like this is this is when you're calm, you want to choose this part of your body. And then when you get into an intense interaction with your partner, put your hand back on that place of your body as a somatic reminder of, I
Mm,
can regulate myself in this moment, this is where peace lives in my body. And practice that outside of of the intense interaction, so that when you get into the intense interaction, you have that set point in your body. You have that somatic experience of what it feels like to be at peace and regulated, and your nervous system running smoothly. So that's something that I found helpful for me in my life. I just wanted to pass that on because I feel like that's a good co-regulation technique or
oh, it's
self-regulation.
wonderful. Absolutely. It's a in NLP they call that anchoring a state.
Yes,
And
I've heard of this too. Yes.
and neurologically, you're setting neurological patterns that
Yes.
you can remember on a procedural level. This is that deep implicit memory that you're utilizing. And by the way, this is the essence of what trauma informed care is. It's connecting to your body and shifting sensations by honoring them and bringing in resources like that positive experience you had with the hand touching your belly that you bring into a stressful situation to change the association. It's beautiful.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for showing up today and sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge. This is incredible. We went so many places, so thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.